uncomfortable. The guiding principle of that sort of approach to life is, why are the buggers lying to me? And that is very much part of journalism, that one of the heart of journalism is really not to believe very often what people say, but more importantly, to subject everything to scrutiny. And now, how does one do it, and who does one choose? Now, I don't think most businessmen or most politicians are dishonest. On the contrary, I think the vast majority are honest and try very hard to do a decent job. It's the few who bring the system and the economy and politics into disrepute. But it's those very few at the top who are dishonest who are the most interesting, because by exposing them, it encourages the vast majority of others not even to tread or even consider to be dishonest. And I take as my lead that extraordinary scene, I don't know if you've seen it, it's the best film about journalism, called All the President's Men. And it's all about Watergate and that astonishing achievement by two journalists at the Washington Post to actually bring down a president, Richard Nixon. And in the basement of a parking lot, Robert Redford, Bob Woodward figure, meets his source, who is he calls Deep Throat. And Deep Throat down there, who turns out to have been an FBI agent, tells Woodford, that he should follow the money. If you follow the money, he'll then discover the truth about Richard Nixon's crimes in the White House. And I've adapted that in my career as journalism, which is to find the victims. You see, every great man, whether he's a politician or a businessman or in football or running a sport like Bernie Ecclestone running Formula One, has always had to tread over people to get to the top. And those people invariably bear a grudge. And most often that grudge is heartfelt. And they always are the people who are most susceptible to tell the story and expose the truth about the person who's got to the top of the pinnacle. So finding the victims is always a good way of finding out what the people at the top of the greasy pole don't want you to know. So I'll get on to how I got there, but I got onto Bernie Ecclestone's plane to write his story, his life story about Formula One, how he built it up. And the reason I got onto the plane was because I was told by actually one of my sons that I should do Bernie Ecclestone because he's a crook. And I thought, well, that was pretty interesting, but I decided at that time to look at another crook called Conrad Black, who at that time owned the Daily Telegraph and was up for trial for fraud in Chicago. And when I finished with Conrad Black, which I'll tell you about later on, but I thought, well, I'll look at Ecclestone because I didn't have an instant candidate. And as I began looking into him, I saw that there were lots of victims. And one of the most interesting victims was a man called Ron Dennis, who owned McLaren cars. Now, he was a victim, he felt, because whereas he had earned only £200 million from Formula One, he was annoyed that Bernie Ecclestone had earned $3 billion. And he felt, therefore, he was suffering and had been cheated out of his money. So as I got more and more into the sport and knew more and more about it, I got a call from Bernie Ecclestone saying, would I like to meet him for lunch? Now, one of the things I should tell you is that I never write authorized biographies. I have never done anything with anyone's permission. And so I agreed to meet him, but I said to him before and during the meal, I said, you know, Mr. Ecclestone, I don't do authorized books. I shall write what I want, but that in the end, you won't read it before it's published. And if I discover you're a crook, it'll go in the book. So he said to me over the table, this is a restaurant in Knightsbridge in central London, he said, as you go through my life, you'll discover I'm no angel. So that became the title of the book, No Angel. And I got to realize that he actually had cut a few corners. And one day we were flying from London down to Nice to go to the Monaco Grand Prix. And he had with him on the plane a man called Flavio Briatore, who had run the Renault team. And the Renault team, orchestrated by Briatore, had staged a deliberate crash in Singapore so that he could win the race with his second car, if you understand how Formula One works. And I said, and Briatore went off to the lavatory, and I said to Ecclestone, I said, why do you mix with people like Flavio? I mean, he's a cheat. And he said to me, you don't understand, Tom. In Formula One, everyone cheats. The trick is not to get caught. and Flav unfortunately got caught. So the whole point is about these people is that the cheating is part of the business, and the trick is not to get caught. And my job in journalism, and to my great delight, has been to catch people who have cheated and confront them with it. One of the people I caught, for example, was a man called Geoffrey Robinson, who was the Paymaster General in the Blair government. He was a great friend of Gordon Brown. He had announced during one period where Robert Maxwell, you don't know if you know who Robert Maxwell is, he was a great crooked tycoon who owned the Daily Mirror and fell off his boat in 1991. And I'd also been his biographer. And I had, in 1988, written his biography and said that he was a crook, and he sued me endlessly. And then he died, fortunately, just before we were going to get into court. And as a result of that, I got control of his whole archives from the Mirror Group headquarters. And Geoffrey Robinson, who at that moment was in 97, was the Paymaster General inside the Brown cabinet, Blair cabinet, announced that he, Geoffrey Robinson, had never taken any money from Robert Maxwell. Now, to his misfortune, I had the invoice where he had charged Maxwell £250,000, and on it had the stamp paid. And so I thought, this is a very interesting man. What sort of man is it who would lie about something as small as that and as obvious as that? And so I looked into Geoffrey Robinson's life. I mean, one of the most important things is why do I choose the subjects? I'm on my 22nd book now, and I've made over 200 documentaries for BBC television. And always it is, I choose the subjects where I find I'm interested, that there's something to uncover. There's something that the person or the company or whatever wants to hide, which is then going to be of public interest. Now, in the case of Geoffrey Robinson, he was the man who was organizing a lot of Britain's finances, especially PFI. And going through his career, I realized he had committed a huge number of sins, whether when he was running British Leyland or when he was running various companies, he constantly was cutting corners. So it was a great pleasure to actually write his story, finding the victims all over the world who were prepared to talk, the people who had been cheated, who had been witness to his cheating. And in the end, I called him up, because of course I hadn't bothered to call him while I was doing researching and writing the book. And he agreed to meet me at the Dorchester, where he was living, or Grosvenor House Hotel in Park Lane in London. And he said, what is it actually you've got on me? And I said, I've got the invoice. He said, which invoice? I said, the invoice you gave to Robert Maxwell. And he said, well, then you've got me, haven't you? And then I ate my kipper. It was a breakfast meeting, and said farewell. And my success was that he was thrown out of the House of Commons, suspended for 3 weeks, and never returned to the cabinet. Now, the same happened with one other great success was Richard Branson. Now, why did I choose Richard Branson? At the time, I was finishing a book about Mohammed Fayed, who owned Harrods, Fulham Football Club, and a lot more. Mohammed Fayed was an extraordinary story, which I got to pick up because I got to know him because I'd written a biography of a man called Tiny Rowland. Tiny Rowland was an amazing businessman who straddled Africa for a company called Lonhro. And Rowland and Fayed had argued about the ownership of Harrods, and I got to know Rowland, where I won't bother boy with, but he was an extraordinary character, a maverick. You see, what is the sad thing at the moment in Britain is there are not many Trump-type mavericks, people who are running business empires anymore. That has really been cleaned up. So my cast of targets is unfortunately disappearing. People like Maxwell, Rowland, Fayed, Branson, Richard Desmond, all these people I've written about, and I'm running out of targets. But anyway, I had chosen Fayed because for various reasons I got to know him, and when Princess Diana died with his son in Paris, I got on a plane, a helicopter, with the pathologist, went to Paris about less than 24 hours after she died, and in Paris went to the Ritz Hotel with his head of security and interviewed all the people who had spent the previous 24 hours with Diana and Dodi till they obviously left the hotel, crashed and died. And while interviewing them, realized that Fayed ran a very, very strange operation, that most of them were lying to me about those hours that Diana and Dodi had spent in the hotel. But more importantly, I then discovered that they had been secretly recording my conversations with these people. So I came back and I thought, really, who is Mohammed Fayed? Where did he actually come from, and what was the secret to his success? And discovered that he was indeed an extraordinary rogue, protected by amazing numbers of armed guards, and had an extraordinary career in Saudi Arabia, in Haiti, in Europe, and in America. And during writing this book, I then went to Dubai, where he'd made his fortune, and the Maktoums there, who hated Fayed because he had built their airports and he'd built their schools and roads when they were really at the beginning of their development in the 60s, realized he'd swindled them of about 25% of every bill. So they gave him a lot of help, and this is the other side to journalism. When you look for the victims, it doesn't mean that they're at the bottom of the pile, just an accountant or whatever. It can also be a ruler, like the Maktoums who ruled Dubai, and they gave me a lot of help. And I met the man with whom he had done his frauds, a man called Al-Tajir, who owns Highland Spring Water, and he'd been the ambassador of the country here. But the key thing is this, that while writing this book and researching it, I got a call from the Maktoum's head of security, and he said to me, I've got good news and bad news for you. I said, well, tell me the bad news first. He said, well, Fayed has taken out a contract to find someone to break your fingers so you can't write the book. So I said, what's the good news? He said, well, he can't find anybody to do it. But he said, there is now bad news. I said, what's that? He said, he couldn't find anyone in London, but he's now looking in Liverpool. And so when the book came out, of course, he was very displeased. He tried various ways of setting me up and to buy stolen pictures, all sorts of things. And that's the other side of journalism, which is this, that you've got to always be very careful in these sort of investigative journalism, whatever, that you're not set up by a lie. And the lies don't only come from the perpetrators you're chasing, the targets, like a Fayed or Richard Desmond or Maxwell, but also from the police. I mean, one of the earliest examples I got of dishonesty was I was doing a film for the BBC of a woman called Rose Dugdale. She was a very rich daughter of an insurance broker in London who had gone funny and gone off with an IRA murderer. And she then tried to rescue another IRA man using a helicopter, which she came down on a jail in Northern Ireland. And it was an astonishing story of her love affairs, and then she stole art from one of her father's best friends, all sorts of things. Anyway, I went to see the police in Belfast, and they told me that her relationship with the IRA man had been consummated. There's no doubt about it. They'd found semen on the sheet. I then went to Dublin and talked to the secret police, the security service there, and they said there was absolutely no evidence whatsoever on the sheets that she'd had sex with this IRA man. Now, the question is, clearly one of them were lying. And one of the most interesting things always in journalism and that sort of work is that people have an agenda. When they meet you, they don't meet you because they love you. They meet you because they want to tell you something to harm somebody else. And in the course of that harm, in the course of that telling of the narrative, they will invariably gild it. They'll invariably distort it. And the journalist's job is to actually distill the truth from the fiction and the exaggeration. But the journalist's job is to do something else, which is terribly, terribly important in all these stories, and that's to tell a story. One of the great weaknesses at the moment of journalism is that it will recite facts, and very often they're facts set out by a PR man or something, but they're not set out in a way which is interesting to the reader or the viewer. Because the wonderful thing about journalism is it's humanity. It is about people, and people have a story to tell. It starts at the beginning and it has an end. And the way you craft your story, the way you tell your story, is to write it as a narrative with a climax. And the climax is whether it's the death of someone or the defrauding of someone or the happiness of someone. But it's got to have a build-up, and it's got to be paced. And one of the pleasures I have in telling the story, for example, of Richard Branson was to start at the beginning and get to the end. And the beginning, of course, his version of the beginning, I discovered very quickly, was a completely dishonest story. And his whole story that he puts out through Virgin Press, which is very much part of his life and his business, which is the promotion of the brand and of him, is not true. And it was finding all the people on the way who'd been cheated by him, who'd been lied to him by him, who'd lost money because of him, who'd sued him and won, or sued him and lost, to tell the story of this man, which was completely different to what he had presented. So my book came out in the year 2000, and by coincidence, the serialization of the Daily Mail started on the very day that the lottery company, where it was complaining to the court, Branson had made great play to get control of the lottery, which would have made Virgin a phenomenally valuable company because it would have had the brand promoted every day as the Virgin Lottery. And he'd won. He'd lost the first time, but he'd won on the second time. And the company which owned it, the lottery franchise, appealed to the court saying the process had been inaccurate and unfair and distorted. On that very day, the Daily Mail serialization of my book came out, and it said Branson's a crook, which he was. I'd discovered he'd defrauded Virgin Music shareholders. I'd gone to Japan and found a company and businessmen there who were good witnesses to Branson's frauds there, and also found out he'd been defrauding the taxman, and that was also pretty important. So not surprising, the judge, when he was hearing the application to have the award for the lottery reconsidered, said that he didn't think Branson should have the lottery. And sure enough, Branson lost the lottery and it went back to the original franchise holders. Now, I thought that was one of the greatest successes I've ever had because I'd actually defeated Branson and cost him a huge amount of money. Now, the reason I had chosen Branson to write about him was as I was finishing the Fayed book, Branson had won a libel action against the man who'd won and designed the original lottery, an American called Guy Snowden. And he'd contrived using the media and using Panorama to get Guy Snowden to libel him, Branson. It was a bit complicated, I won't bore you with that, but it was an astonishingly dishonest ruse by Branson to demolish the reputation of a good and honest man who'd beaten him in business. When he stood on the steps of the law courts, having won his libel action against Guy Snowden, he said, "My mother always taught me to tell the truth, and that is why I won today." And I thought, that cannot be true. Nobody gets the top of a tree like Branson's by telling the truth. And sure enough, I found that the champion of truth was in fact a terrible liar, and proved it, because he then sued me twice, and Branson versus Bower is one of the cornerstones of libel law. I won, he lost. And it establishes that journalists have the right to criticize people, people in power, with various prerequisites, and Branson was clearly most unhappy. And he said after my book came out, and was serialized and was damaged his brand pretty comprehensively, he wrote, "What I have read has offended me on every single level. It is a foul, foul piece of work from the first words to the last. Really rotten, nasty stuff." Now, for me, that was no greater accolade, and it went on the back of the paperback to promote it. Now, one of the points about these people and about all these things is that they do respond to journalism. I wrote the biography of Gordon Brown in 2003-04. And why I chose him was because I couldn't understand why Gordon Brown had so much power in the Labour Party, why Blair was so fearful of him. And I'd heard stories about that he was pretty unpleasant, and no one had looked into his life before. And the whole thing about New Labour was that they manipulated the media phenomenally. All the newspapers, all the television and radio stations, just like obsequious morons, repeated what New Labour told them. And I discovered that Gordon Brown was a pretty nasty piece of work, very violent, treated his girlfriends appallingly, and told people a lot of pretty grotesque untruths. And when the book came out in the middle of the 2004 party conference, Brown was absolutely furious, which he made no secret to me, how angry he and Ed Balls was pretty rude to me and all sorts of things, but the book was serialized, it sold huge numbers, it did very, very well. And in that book, I had written that one of the great weaknesses of Brown was he talked about poverty in Africa, but he'd never been to Africa. Within 3 days, the Treasury announced that Gordon Brown was leading a special business trade delegation to Africa. So I thought, this is amazing, what power I have. So I wrote that Gordon Brown had never been to China. I wrote it in the Daily Mail. Within literally a week, he had announced yet another trip to China. So I thought, if I'm that good, I'll have one more go. And I wrote in another article, Gordon Brown has never been to the moon. Now, it was then only, I suppose, a matter of time before I then decided to have a look at Tony Blair. One of the interesting things about journalism is that you can choose who to write about. I started writing, my first book, and my first really big films were about intelligence and spies and the whole of the Cold War and things like that. There's another story. But my first real big expose was I was lying on the beach in Italy and read a story about a German ex-SS man, a Nazi, who had executed 355 Italians in retaliation for 35 German soldiers being killed. And he'd escaped from an Italian prison and gone back to Germany. And the Germans had refused to return him back to Italy to continue his sentence for mass murder. And I couldn't understand, why did the Germans not send him back? It was a simple question as that. And so when I got back to England, I asked various people who were experts. And this is the thing about journalism. Always go to the experts. So when I was writing, for example, a biography of Simon Cowell, who I'd never even heard of when I began the book, I had no idea who he was. There was only someone said, oh, you should write about Simon Cowell. I said, well, who's he? So I went up then, talked to experts in the music business. When it was the Formula One, Bernie Ecclestone, I went to people who were the writers, the specialist writers in Formula One. So in the Nazi war crimes, the whole thing is I went to people who'd actually worked in Germany after the war, and more importantly, had an interest in Nazi war crimes. And a couple of them said to me, well, everything was dealt with at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. But one man said to me, no, he said, Nuremberg was only 22 war criminals, the most important, but all the rest stayed in Germany and were put back in power by the British and American allies. And I said, well, how could that be? He said, yes, I don't know what happened, he said, but that is undoubtedly the truth. Now, I was very, very lucky, and luck always plays a part in journalism, but this was 1976, probably long before you were born. And at that time, Harold Wilson changed the laws on the release of official documents from 50 years to 30 years. And the Americans had done it just a bit earlier. So just when I thought, well, what actually happened in post-war Germany, the records of the British occupation army and the government were released. So I could see in the Public Record Office in London and in Washington how the British and Americans had put the Nazis, doctors who'd done euthanasia, policemen who'd murdered people for all sorts of reasons, judges who'd sent innocent men to be hanged, generals who had committed the most appalling atrocities in Eastern Europe and Russia, all back into power, all back in the police service, the judiciary, everything in post-war Germany. And what was more exciting was most of them were still alive, both the criminals, the Nazi war criminals, and the British and American officials who'd done it. And there were their papers which showed how they'd done it. So therefore, that was very lucky. And it was my first book I wrote called Blind Eye to Murder. Now, why I tell you that in parentheses is this, that the reason I wrote about Blair, which the book came out earlier this year, and was a great success, I must admit, I was very pleased with, was that it was at a dinner party with some friends locally where I live in London. And at the party, at the dinner, was a couple who were very close friends of Tony Blair. And we got to talking about Blair's record. And she said he had been an astonishing success in education. And I said, I don't think so. Education When the Tories left, there were 30% of children left school literate or innumerate, and it was just the same 12 years later when Labour left. And there was a huge argument, and she insisted it had improved. It was only 20% leaving illiterate and innumerate. And I suddenly realized that nobody had actually examined what had happened in the Blair era. We all knew what the Blairites thought because there were 30 books by Blair, by Alistair Darling, by Blunkett, by Mandelson, endless books by Alistair Campbell, all the rest. But no one had actually done the book from the other side. And what I did was, I thought, well, the only way to really tell the story differently is not to go and talk to the Blairites or give you the spin, but to talk to the civil servants, to talk to the generals, to talk to the lower politicians and confront them with what their civil servants had said to me, what had happened. And so I decided that I should choose 5 areas where Blair had been most active: health, education, immigration, which was pretty important, energy, and of course the wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, and found a completely different story to what the Blairites themselves had spun. And that is what's so exciting about journalism, that although it's a very lonely job, and sometimes a very frustrating job, especially when you contact people and they say they don't want to talk, and very often when people who you know have got something valuable to tell can't be persuaded, but you still persist. The number of times the phone goes down in your ear, the number of times you don't get a reply, you must never be deterred. Because if you carry on and persist, in the end, people just feel they have no choice but to talk to you. And once you've established a reputation of having delivered the truth, then people feel they've got to talk to you because they want their version told. And so with Blair, it was exactly like that. I got to talk to over 200 people. And it was a fascinating story, which is completely different to the one the Blairites have spun in the past. And I didn't talk to Blair at all. I didn't need to, because his own book told his version. And what was very interesting was that the Chilcot report on the war said nothing more than I discovered from the generals and the civil servants and all the rest. And one of the exciting things in understanding Blair and all those things is that he went to see, and this is an important point about these people in power, is he went to see a man called Shimon Peres. Shimon Peres he just died the other day. He was one of the leading architects of New Israel, of modern Israel. And Peres said to me that he told Blair that a politician must be both a narcissist and paranoid, not one or the other, but both at the same time. And Blair agreed. He smiled. And that, of course, is exactly what is the source of these people's power and their resilience. That when they get to the top of the greasy pole, you can kick them, you can prick them, you can damage them. But they have the astonishing tenacity always to stay at the top. And that is true about so many. Look at Keith Vaz. It's extraordinary. Here's a man who's constantly being embarrassed by his deeds, and yet has now been elected to the Justice Committee in the House of Commons. And that is the point of it. There's self-belief that always seeks to defeat journalism and those who tell the truth. And one of the reasons is that they can always, their vanity is what always is able to overcome the journalist, or not always, but so often. And I think the point is this. There was a marvelous point in Blair's life where he was asked by the Labour Party's conference magazine, I think in the year 2000, to describe what was his favourite food. And he said it was fish and chips, which he bought from the local chippy in Islington, where he lives in London. And the Islington cookbook came out that very week and asked him the same, what is your favourite food? And he said it's fresh fettuccine garnished with exotic sauces of olive oil, sun-dried tomatoes, and capers. And that is the point. Every audience gets a different answer. And that is the point about these people. And so the heart of journalism is obviously good research. It is to go through the printed sources. It's to scrutinize the old newspaper cuttings. It's to find out where is the gap between one version and another version. In the case of Robert Maxwell, who was this amazing tycoon who sued me about 11 times before he died, it was the astonishing story of a man who would say one thing to one person and one thing to another. And in the film I made about him for BBC television in 1973, is how I got to know him, there was this marvelous man called Philip Ockill. And Philip Ockill sold encyclopedias for Maxwell in the 60s. And Ockill told this story, and he sat there stroking his cat. And he said, I went to Mr. Maxwell, and Maxwell said to me, Ockill, you don't seem to like me. Why is that? And Ockill said, well, as I said to Mr. Maxwell, because you're the sincerest liar I've ever met. And you know, said Ockill, I think he was really pleased by that accolade. And that is the point, that lying is the way in which they can always seek to overcome, and they do so often overcome. I mean, if you take Conrad Black, who I wrote about and who sued me as well, here was a man who constantly, he owned the Daily Telegraph, he committed some terrible frauds against the shareholders in America. And today, he returns to London, having spent 4 years in prison, and still protests his innocence. And that is the point about so many people in power, that they never actually want to admit they're wrong. So, to come to the end, it is great fun. There's nothing that gives me greater pleasure than to cause the pinprick. I once ended with a very long trial. Richard Desmond, the owner of the Daily Express and OK magazine, and others sued me, and it actually went to trial. It was a 3-week trial in London. It was the last libel hearing in front of a jury before they abolished juries for libel trials. And in the end, he lost, and it was the most wonderful moment. And it cost him £4.5 million in costs for both him and myself. And what was remarkable was that every day of your life as a journalist brings a new experience, sometimes good, very often bad, very often frustrating. You have to have your own belief in what you're doing. That is essential. Even at my age, when I'm writing my new book, it is always, when you get the no, you've got to think, I won't let the buggers get me down. I'll still get better by tomorrow. I'll still get what I want the next day. And what was remarkable in the Desmond trial was that I was not sure about the jury. And there was particularly one girl who arrived every morning at 9:30, every day immaculately dressed in new outfit, went to the back corner and went to sleep. And I thought, well, I've lost her, God knows. And she slept for 3 weeks at the back of the court. So when I won the case, they all came round, the jury all came round me and congratulated me. And I said to her, but you were asleep the whole trial. What? I really thought you weren't going to find for me. And she said to me, oh no, when I arrived, I was going to find for you before even the trial began, so I didn't need to listen to the evidence. So that is the heart of luck and of also conviction. And I mean, I'll take any questions. There are so many other things to tell you about, but I do urge you, I've had the most marvelous, marvelous career. I've had the most marvelous adventures all over the world, met the most astonishing people. Sometimes it ends badly, but invariably it always ends good. But the most important thing in journalism, if I can just end in this, is this. Just do what you believe is interesting. Follow your instinct. Follow what you think is the story. Tell it as a story. Start at the beginning, find the witnesses. Persuade them to talk to you. You persuade people to talk to you by engaging them in conversation, because people love talking about themselves. People love telling you their story. It starts small, but it'll become big as you get more and more confidence. And just realize that if it interests you, it will interest your audience. And if it interests your audience, how do you make it really appealing? And that is the art of telling the story. And to learn how to tell the story, whether it's in print or on sound or television, is to actually watch and learn from the others. You won't be able to reinvent the wheel. You won't be able to reinvent how writing is done. Just learn from what others have done and you just repeat it, because they invariably have found the formula. But the trick is to find a way of telling the story in the most interesting way, and to find something that appeals to the audience because it is relevant to their lives today, or they didn't know it was relevant, and so you're introducing them something new. So that is my heart, my lesson to you about journalism. Right, any questions? Is there time?
Yeah. Does anyone want to ask Tom any questions? I was thinking particularly maybe on a sports angle, something you've done in the past.
What's your opinion on Sam Allardyce and
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't talk about the football book. It was called Broken Dreams. I really didn't know anything about football. I just had two of my sons were mad Spurs supporters, and it would be a nice way to spend a year going with them to the matches. And I knew nobody. And all I knew was I found one journalist, which is, again, as I explained to you, I found one journalist on the Daily Mail who's a football reporter who said, thank goodness you've come. It's a completely crooked sport. All the agents and the managers are on the taking bungs, brown envelopes and the lot. Here's a list of agents and suspected club managers and officials. Why don't you set off? So I set off. I think I went to absolutely every match, every ground in the Premier League. I talked to all the agents and managers, and of course, Allardyce was always on the horizon. He was pretty small. The biggest of them at the time, one of the biggest, was Harry Redknapp. In West Ham, they called Broken Dreams Harry's book, because it tells the story of how Harry, during his period running West Ham, bought something like traded like 120 players, some of whom never played at all. And each time he bought and sold, he allegedly, I must say, took a kickback. And he was then fired for having effectively bankrupted in the view of the owner, a man called Terry Brown, the club. And I got to see Harry in Portsmouth. He was the manager at that stage, much bigger than Sam Allardyce, but it was classic. And he said, why should I talk to you? And I said to him, because, Mr. Redknapp, I want to help you. That's always a good line, because they can't understand why should a journalist want to help them. But of course, what I really wanted was his version of this astonishing trade in players. Now, as a result of the book, the police in the end did prosecute Harry Redknapp, if you remember, for having an account in Monaco in the HSBC bank. The bank's account name was the name of Harry's dog. The money was paid into the account by the owner of Portsmouth. And Harry told the jury he had no idea that the money was there, although it was in his dog's name and he was the sole signatory. And the jury believed him. And he got away with it. And that was astonishing. And he was, of course, very lucky. But that's one of the astonishing things. Grobbelaar, I don't know if you know the goalkeeper Grobbelaar, he was filmed by the Sun newspaper taking a bag of money for throwing a game, for not saving goals. He only got 2/3 of the money because by accident he saved one of the goals he was meant to let in. But he, in the end, he sued the Sun, and despite the film evidence, the jury found it in his favor. He was prosecuted. The jury found in Grobbelaar's favor. It's like the police. Juries will not convict footballers or policemen. But in the end, although the jury had found in Grobbelaar's favor, the appeal court said the jury were wrong and they should have found against Grobbelaar. But I mean, it's the most astonishing game, football. There was a man called George Graham. George Graham was the manager of Arsenal, and he came back from Norway with a suitcase filled with pound notes, something like £135,000, which was his cut in the transfer of a player. And he was discovered, and he was kicked out of Arsenal. At that moment, Terry Venables and Alan Sugar were in a bitter battle in court about a management thing, and Venables tells in court how Clough, I've forgotten Clough's name, Brian Clough wanted to do a trade of Terry Sheringham, who was a very famous player at that time, and Clough had been given by Terry Venables £50,000, and told the court that he's told Alan Sugar that Cloughie likes a bung. And that was the way that they could get Terry Sheringham to transfer from Notts Forest to Spurs. And Sugar said, I'm absolutely outraged. This is the most terrible thing in football. All this corruption, all this money, all these brown envelopes. We're cleaning it up, and that's why I had to fire Terry Venables. Well, Venables went. Spurs went down the league. They were in the relegation zone, and Sugar had a problem. He was about to lose and go down from the Premier League. And he decided there's only one man who could save his team, and his name was Graham. So he took the man who had been found guilty of fraud to save his team. So it's endemic in the sport. And that was, I mean, I tell those stories in the book, and it was, of course, it had a profound effect that in the end they tried to tighten it up. And the thing about the Allardyce story was, when he was recorded, and of course it was absolutely ethical and the right thing to do, that the rules were there as a result, actually, of my book having exposed how they're all getting around the rules. But he said, I can find a way around the rules. And that was the beauty of that sting. And so it was great journalism. Whether it'll improve the performance of the England team, we don't know.
Time for one more question? Anybody? Matthew?
I'm quite interested in, like, you talk to hear what your thoughts are on UKIP donor Aaron Banks' plan to drain the swamp, and to target 200 laziest, most corrupt MPs in Parliament.
Yeah, I've heard about it. Well, I think it's to do with in my view. Well, I'm not a fan of Aaron Banks or Nigel Farage. But look, the whole point about this is, you see, and that's what's so exciting, that UKIP creates stories. It's great for journalism. I mean, the people are upset by Trump, people are upset by Brexit. I say, okay, you're upset, but it's great journalism. And as long as people aren't dying, as long as it's peaceful, change is good for journalists because people then want to know the news. It's like if there's a drought and you've got water, it's great business. So I take by now a pretty sanguine view. If people are dishonest, I'm pretty keen to hammer them. I think Trump's past has been well exposed as pretty dishonest and shady, but the electorate took a different view, and a large number gave him the vote. And we'll see what happens. But what is remarkable is that, you know, that journalism can work and work and work, and journalists to expose people for doing wrong, and the public ignore them. And part of the reason is that you don't get their attention. You know, that's the tragedy, that the truth is often ignored. But, you know, you had a great time exposing them.
Okay, the next speaker is booked in about 5 or 10 minutes. So I'd like to just round off by once again thanking Tom for coming up at short notice. And if everyone can